The creak of weathered floorboards beneath dusty boots announced his arrival. Mason Ford stood in the doorway of Copper Creek's only schoolhouse, his silhouette stark against the blinding New Mexico sun. His eyes, hard as flint from years on the trail, scanned the modest room until they found what he sought: a small boy seated in the corner, clutching something in his tiny hands. An old, battered cowboy hat, far too large for the child's frame. The year was 1878, and Mason had ridden for 3 weeks straight, following whispers and rumors that had led him to this remote settlement. 6 years had passed since that terrible night when he'd lost everything. 6 years of searching, of hoping against hope. Now, as he watched the boy, dark hair falling across his forehead just like hers, eyes the same shade of amber as his own, Mason felt his heart thunder against his ribs. "Can I help you, sir?" The schoolteacher, a young woman with kind eyes, approached cautiously. "School's nearly finished for the day." Mason cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the dust on his clothes, the weeks of trail grime that marked him as an outsider. "Madam, I'm looking for a boy, my boy." Her eyebrows rose. "I'm Miss Sarah Collins. I teach all the children here in Copper Creek." "Perhaps if you told me the child's name." "Thomas," Mason said, the name catching in his throat. "Thomas Ford, he'd be 7 years old now." The teacher's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing her features. She glanced toward the boy in the corner who had grown still, his small fingers tightening around the battered hat. "That's Tommy," she confirmed softly. "Tommy Matthews, as we know him. He came to Copper Creek about 5 years ago." "The Matthews family took him in after the raid," Mason finished, his voice hollow. "Comanche raid on a wagon train heading north from El Paso. I was away, scouting ahead. When I came back," Miss Collins nodded solemnly. "The Matthews are good people. They've raised him as their own." Mason's gaze never left the boy. "That hat he's holding. It's mine. I left it with his mother that morning, told her to keep it safe till I returned." The emotion rising in his chest threatened to choke him. "She must have given it to him to remember me by." The final bell rang, and children began gathering their things, their curious glances darting between their teacher and the strange, trail-worn cowboy standing in their schoolroom. Miss Collins gently instructed them to head home, her attention carefully divided between her charges and the tense situation unfolding. When only Thomas remained, the teacher beckoned to him. "Tommy, would you come here, please? There's someone who'd like to meet you." The boy approached slowly, still clutching the hat, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He stopped several feet from Mason, looking up at the tall stranger. "Hello, Thomas," Mason said, dropping to one knee to meet the boy at eye level, his voice soft, unsteady. "Do you know who I am?" The child shook his head, then hesitated. "But I know this hat," he said, holding up the battered Stetson. "Ma says it belonged to my real pa. She says he was a brave cowboy who would come find me someday." A sound escaped Mason's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "She was right, son. I've been looking for you since the day I lost you, since the day I lost your ma." "My ma said to keep this safe," the boy continued, his small fingers tracing the hat's faded leather band. "She said when my pa came, this would be proof that I'm his boy." Mason reached out a trembling hand, not touching the child yet, just hovering in the space between them. "May I?" he asked, indicating the hat. Thomas handed it over. Mason turned it in his hands, his fingers finding the notch in the brim, the carved initials inside the band MF. And the small leather star his wife had sewn inside as a token of luck when they'd first married. The emotion that had been building in Mason's chest finally broke. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks, cutting paths through the dust of the trail. "I've been searching for you for so long," he whispered, no longer able to maintain the stoic demeanor that had been his shield through years of grief and loneliness. Miss Collins stood quietly to the side, her own eyes glistening as she witnessed the reunion. "Thomas has been waiting for you too, Mr. Ford, even if he didn't know it." Mason looked up at her gratefully, then back to his son. "Thomas, I know you have a family now, the Matthews, I respect that, but I'm your father and I've never stopped looking for you, never stopped loving you." The boy studied Mason's face, searching for something. Ma Matthews said my real pa would come someday. She said I'd know him because he'd recognize the hat. A small smile formed on his lips. And she said he'd probably cry because that's what happens when someone loves you more than anything. A watery laugh escaped Mason. Your Ma Matthews is a wise woman. The schoolhouse door opened, and a middle-aged couple entered. Clearly the Matthews, come to collect their ward. They stopped short at the tableau before them, Thomas standing close to a kneeling stranger, the man holding the old hat they knew so well, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, Miss Collins said, stepping forward. This is Mason Ford, Thomas's father. The air in the small schoolhouse grew thick with tension. Mr. Matthews placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder, his expression guarded. We've raised the boy as our own for 5 years, Mr. Mason nodded, rising slowly to his feet, and I thank you for it, more than I can say. Mrs. Matthews' eyes softened as she looked between Mason and Thomas. He's kept that hat by his bed every night since he came to us, wouldn't let it out of his sight for years. It was all he had left, Mason said, his voice breaking. All I had left was the hope of finding him. The Matthews exchanged a long look, years of unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Mr. Matthews stepped forward. You understand we need proof, he said, not unkindly. The boy's been through enough. Mason nodded. Of course. He knelt again, showing Thomas the inside of the hat band. See these initials, MF, Mason Ford, and this star. Your mother sewed it in the day we were married, said it would guide me home when I was on the trail. Thomas touched the small leather star with wonder. Ma used to tell me about the stars, said they were windows to heaven, and she could see my real ma up there watching over me. Mrs. Matthews stepped forward then, her eyes shining with tears. Tommy, is this the man from your dreams, the one you said would come one day? Thomas looked up at Mason, studying his face with the serious intensity only a child can manage. Slowly, he nodded. I think so. He knows about the hat, and he's crying just like you said he would. The schoolroom had emptied of children, but word had spread quickly through the small town. Townspeople began to gather outside the schoolhouse, their murmurs forming a backdrop to the drama unfolding within. Mason, aware of the growing audience but focused only on his son, placed the hat gently on Thomas's head. It was still far too large, slipping down over his eyes in a way that made the boy giggle despite the tension. I've carried the memory of you every day, Mason said softly. Searched every town, followed every rumor. I never stopped looking. Mr. Matthews cleared his throat. The boy needs stability, Mr. Ford. A home, we've given him that. I know, Mason acknowledged. And I'm not here to tear him away from people who love him, but I'm his father. I've earned my place in his life. The gathered townspeople had moved closer now, forming a semicircle in the schoolhouse doorway. Among them was the town's sheriff, his expression watchful but not hostile. I can vouch for what happened to the wagon train, the sheriff said, stepping forward. Word came through official channels. There was a survivor, a woman who died of her wounds shortly after being found. She'd hidden a child, they said. A boy. Mason's head snapped up. You knew my wife, Elizabeth? The sheriff nodded solemnly. She was brought to the doctor in Fort Sumner. Lived long enough to tell them about the attack, to say her boy was hidden in a dry creek bed wrapped in a blanket. Said his father would come looking for him. A choked sound escaped Mason. Elizabeth had survived long enough to save their son, to set in motion the events that had led him here. She gave the rescue party that hat, the sheriff continued. Said to make sure the boy kept it, that his father would recognize it. The assembled townsfolk murmured among themselves. Mrs. Matthews dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while her husband stood stoic but visibly moved. What will you do now, Mr. Ford? Miss Collins asked gently. Mason looked from Thomas to the Matthews, then to the gathering of townspeople. His journey had been singular in its purpose: find his son. Beyond that, he hadn't allowed himself to think. I aim to be a father to my boy, he said firmly, but I won't uproot him if he's happy here. I could. He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I could settle in Copper Creek, find work, get to know my son proper like with your blessing. This last was directed to the Matthews. Thomas, still wearing the oversized hat, looked up at Mason with newfound wonder. You're really staying? "If I'm welcome," Mason replied, his gaze moving to the Matthews. The couple exchanged another long look. Finally, Mrs. Matthews stepped forward and took Thomas's small hand in hers. "Tommy has been the light of our lives these past 5 years," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But we've always told him about his real parents, always kept your memory alive." She reached out and tentatively touched Mason's arm. "We have room enough in our hearts to welcome you, Mr. Ford, for Tommy's sake." The tension that had held Mason rigid for so many years, the grief, the desperate hope, the lonely pursuit began to melt away. He dropped to his knees once more, opening his arms to his son. "Thomas," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "May I?" The boy hesitated only a moment before stepping into his father's embrace. Mason pulled him close, burying his face in his son's hair, weeping openly now. The hat tumbled from Thomas's head as Mason lifted him, holding him as if he might disappear again at any moment. "My boy," Mason whispered, his voice breaking. "My son." The gathered townspeople, witnessing this most private of reunions, fell silent. Even the most hardened among them found themselves moved by the sight of the weathered cowboy claiming his lost child, the years of grief giving way to joy. Sarah Collins, watching from her place by the teacher's desk, felt her heart swell with the beauty and pain of the moment. In this harsh frontier where life was often cruel and love a luxury few could afford, such reunions were rare miracles. The sheriff stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Folks, let's give them some privacy," he said, ushering the onlookers back. As the crowd dispersed, Mason set Thomas down gently but kept a hand on his shoulder, as if afraid to break contact. "We'd be pleased if you'd join us for supper, Mr. Ford," Mrs. Matthews offered. "We have much to discuss, and I'm sure Tommy has 1,000 questions." "Mason, please," he replied, picking up the fallen hat and holding it reverently. "And I'd be honored." Thomas looked up at him, his small face solemn. "Will you tell me about my real ma every day?" Mason promised, his voice thick. "Every day for the rest of my life." As they walked from the schoolhouse into the golden light of late afternoon, Mason Ford felt, for the first time in 6 long years, that he had come home. The Matthews home sat on the outskirts of Copper Creek, a modest but well-maintained cabin with a small barn and corral. A few chickens scratched in the yard, and a milk cow lowed softly from its pen. It wasn't grand, but it was clear that Thomas had been raised in a home filled with care. Mason tethered his horse to the hitching post, patting the animal's neck. "Rest easy, Scout," he murmured. "Looks like we might be staying a while." Thomas watched with interest. "Is that your horse? Did you ride him all the way here?" "I did," Mason confirmed, retrieving his saddlebags. "Scout's been with me through it all, 1,500 miles at least looking for you." The boy's eyes widened. 1,500 miles? That's farther than forever," Mason smiled, the expression transforming his weather-beaten face. "Not quite forever, but far enough, worth every step." Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting. "Mrs. Matthews, call me Margaret, please," she insisted, busied herself at the stove while her husband, Edward, poured coffee for the adults. "We don't have much," Edward said, gesturing Mason to a chair at the sturdy wooden table. "But what we have, we share willingly." "I've eaten trail dust and hardtack for weeks," Mason replied. "Your hospitality is more than generous." Sarah Collins had been invited to join them, a neutral presence to help ease the inevitable tensions. She sat quietly, observing the cautious dance between Mason and the Matthews, the way Thomas kept stealing glances at his newfound father. Over a simple but hearty meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, Mason began to fill in the gaps of the past 6 years. He spoke of the cattle drive that had taken him away from the wagon train that fateful day, of returning to find devastation, of the years spent tracking every rumor of survivors. "The Comanche took no prisoners that day, far as I could tell," he said grimly, mindful of Thomas listening. "But there were stories of a woman who'd survived long enough to reach Fort Sumner. I never knew it was Elizabeth until today. The family that found Tommy brought him to us," Margaret explained. "We'd lost our own son to typhoid the year before. They knew we had room in our home and in our hearts." Mason's gaze fell on Thomas, who was soaking up every word. "And I thank God they did, that you did." Edward cleared his throat. We've never hidden the truth from the boy, always told him his real pa might come looking one day. I prayed you would, Thomas said suddenly, his small voice earnest. Every night. Mason had to look away, overcome. Sarah, seeing his struggle, gently changed the subject. Mason, what did you do before the raid? She asked. He composed himself. I was a drover mainly. Good with horses. Elizabeth and I had a small spread near El Paso, nothing fancy, but it was ours. We were heading north to Colorado when. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. But that's the past. What matters now is Thomas. What do you intend moving forward? Edward asked directly. Mason met his gaze. I want to be a father to my son. I have some savings enough to start over. If there's work to be had in Copper Creek, I'm willing. There's always need for a good horseman, Edward conceded. The stage line keeps a station here, and ranches in the territory are always looking for experienced hands. And the school could use repairs, Sarah added. The town council has been putting it off for months. Mason nodded, grateful. I'm handy with tools, happy to help with that. Thomas, who had been quiet for some time, piped up. Could I call you Pa? The simple question struck Mason like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't speak. If that's what you want, son, he finally managed, I'd be honored. Margaret reached across the table and covered Thomas's small hand with her own. Tommy, this is a lot of change all at once. Mr. Ford Mason is your father by birth, but you know that we love you too. I know, the boy said seriously. You're Ma and Pa Matthews, and he's my real pa. He looked up at Mason. Right, Mason confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. Edward nodded slowly. We could make this work, I think, for Tommy's sake. There's a vacant cabin near the creek, Margaret suggested. Old man Jenkins lived there before he passed last winter. It needs work, but it's sound. Mason looked at her gratefully. That would be more than fair. As the evening progressed, the initial tension began to ease. Thomas showed Mason his small collection of treasures, a polished stone, a hawk's feather, a carved wooden horse Edward had made for him. And the hat, which he retrieved from his room, placing it reverently on the table. Ma, my real ma, she put it on my head when she hid me, Thomas said, his small fingers tracing the brim. She said, keep this safe for your pa, Thomas, he'll come for you. Mason swallowed hard. She was the bravest woman I ever knew, and the smartest. She saved you, son. Do I look like her? Thomas asked hopefully. You have her smile, Mason said softly, and her kind heart. Later, when Thomas had been tucked into bed, the adults spoke more frankly about the arrangements. It was agreed that Mason would stay in the town's small hotel for a few days while he worked on the Jenkins cabin. He would visit Thomas daily, but the boy would continue living with the Matthews for now to maintain stability. It's for the best, Mason acknowledged, though it cost him to say it. He needs time to get to know me, to trust me. You're doing right by him, Edward said, offering his hand. That's all we've ever wanted. As Mason prepared to leave, Sarah walked with him to the door. She had been mostly quiet during the evening, offering support through her presence rather than words. Thank you, Mason said sincerely, for being there today, for teaching my son. Sarah smiled. Thomas is a special boy, bright and kind. You should be proud. I am, Mason replied. Of him and of the people who raised him when I couldn't. They stepped outside into the cool night air. Stars blanketed the New Mexico sky, brilliant in their clarity. Elizabeth used to say the stars were God's way of lighting our path home, Mason said quietly, looking up. I think she was right. Sarah followed his gaze upward. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Mason agreed. The best of us. He turned to Sarah, his expression earnest. I never thought I'd find him. All these years I kept searching, but part of me believed it was hopeless. But you didn't give up, Sarah pointed out. No, Mason acknowledged. I couldn't. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the small frontier town surrounding them. The school repairs, Sarah said finally. Could you really help with that? Mason nodded. First thing tomorrow, if you'd like. I'm good with my hands. The children would appreciate it. The roof leaks something terrible when it rains. Then it's settled, Mason said. I'll stop by in the morning. Sarah hesitated, then spoke. What you did today, coming forward in front of everyone, that took courage. Mason looked at her thoughtfully. Not courage, necessity. He's my son, the only family I have left in this world. Not anymore, Sarah said softly. Now you have the Matthews and Copper Creek if you choose to stay." "I choose to stay," Mason affirmed without hesitation. "Wherever Thomas is, that's where I'll be." As Sarah watched him mount his horse and ride toward town, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. In her 5 years teaching in Copper Creek, she'd seen many things: hardship and joy, cruelty and kindness. But never had she witnessed such raw emotion as when Mason Ford had claimed his son, weeping openly in front of the entire town. It was, she reflected, a rare thing to see in this harsh frontier a man unafraid to show his heart. Rarer still to find one who had traveled so far, endured so much for love alone. The next morning dawned clear and promising. Mason was at the schoolhouse before the first bell, tools in hand, ready to make good on his word. Sarah arrived to find him already on the roof, replacing damaged shingles with skilled efficiency. "You didn't waste any time," she called up to him, shading her eyes against the rising sun. Mason tipped his hat. "Promised I would help. A man's only as good as his word out here." Throughout the day, as Sarah taught her lessons, Mason worked steadily on the school's repairs. Children watched him curiously during their breaks, and Thomas beamed with pride when his classmates whispered about the stranger who was his real father. By week's end, Mason had not only repaired the school but had also begun work on the Jenkins cabin. Word of his story had spread throughout Copper Creek, and many townsfolk offered assistance. Some brought lumber, others helped with the heavy lifting. Even the sheriff pitched in, acknowledging that the town had a duty to help a man who had suffered so much and shown such devotion. Mason spent every available moment with Thomas, teaching him to ride, telling him stories of his mother, building a relationship one careful day at a time. The boy soaked up his father's attention like parched earth in a rainstorm, eager for every scrap of knowledge about his past, his heritage. The Matthews, true to their word, facilitated this growing bond with grace and generosity. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of family, both blood and chosen. Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into this unusual family arrangement. She often joined them for Sunday dinners, offering a neutral perspective when questions of Thomas's upbringing arose. But more than that, she enjoyed Mason's company. His quiet strength, his unwavering devotion to his son, his willingness to compromise for Thomas's well-being all spoke to a character rare in these untamed territories. One evening, as summer gave way to fall, Sarah and Mason sat on the porch of his newly finished cabin. Thomas had fallen asleep inside after an exhausting day of fishing and exploring. The night was cool, the stars brilliant overhead. He asked if he could stay here tonight, Mason said, his voice a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "First time," Sarah smiled. "That's progress. He trusts you." The Matthews were generous to allow it, Mason acknowledged. "They've been more than fair through all of this." "They love him," Sarah said simply. "As do you." Mason nodded, his gaze on the distant mountains. "Never thought I'd have this again, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving." "You've built something good here," Sarah observed. "In just a few months." "Not alone," Mason replied, glancing at her. "You've helped more than you know." The look that passed between them lingered, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Sarah had come to Copper Creek 3 years earlier, a young woman seeking independence and purpose after losing her parents. Teaching had given her both, but friendship, true friendship, had been scarce in the small, hardscrabble town. "I should go," she said finally, rising. "It's getting late." Mason stood as well. "I'll walk you home." "There's no need," Sarah protested. "It's just a few minutes to town." "I insist," Mason said firmly. "These parts aren't always safe after dark." They walked in comfortable silence, the moonlight illuminating their path. Copper Creek was quiet at this hour, most windows darkened, though the saloon still spilled light and raucous laughter into the street. "Will you stay?" Sarah asked suddenly. "In Copper Creek, I mean, once the cabin is finished and you're settled." Mason considered the question. "Thomas is happy here. He has friends, school, the Matthews. I won't uproot him again." "And you, are you happy here?" They had reached Sarah's small house near the school. Mason paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "I'm finding my way," he said honestly. "For the first time in years, I'm looking forward rather than back." Sarah nodded, understanding. Good night, Mason. Good night, Sarah. As autumn deepened, Mason found steady work with the stage line, caring for their horses and occasionally riding shotgun when they were shorthanded. The regular income allowed him to improve his cabin and provide for Thomas during the boys' increasingly frequent visits. The arrangement with the Matthews evolved naturally. Thomas spent weekdays with them, attending school and maintaining the stability of his established routine. Weekends and holidays he spent with Mason, learning to track, to ride, to be comfortable in the wilderness that had claimed his mother but had also shaped his father into the man he was. By Christmas, Mason had become an accepted part of Copper Creek's community. He attended church alongside the Matthews, participated in town meetings, and continued to help with improvements to the school and other public buildings. His skills as a horseman were widely respected, and his quiet dignity had won over even the most skeptical townsfolk. The holiday brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed the territory in pristine white. Mason, Thomas, and the Matthews gathered in Mason's cabin for Christmas dinner, a tradition they agreed to establish for the boys' benefit. Sarah joined them, bringing a fresh baked apple pie and a handmade scarf for Thomas. After dinner, as Thomas played with the wooden figures Mason had carved for him, the adults sat by the fire, content in the warmth of fellowship. "I have an announcement," Edward Matthews said, clearing his throat. "Margaret and I have been considering a move." Mason looked up sharply. "A move? Where to?" "My brother in California has offered me a partnership in his mercantile business," Edward explained. "It's a good opportunity, better than ranching in this hard country." Mason's expression grew guarded. "And Thomas," Margaret reached over to place a reassuring hand on Mason's arm, "that's what we wanted to discuss. We love Tommy as our own, you know that, but these past months watching him with you." She glanced at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. "We think it might be time for him to live with his father full-time." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Mason stared into the fire, processing their words. "You're his parents too," he said finally. "In every way that matters, I won't take him from you." "You wouldn't be," Edward assured him. "We'd visit, write letters, but Tommy belongs with his father now. He needs you and you need him." Thomas, sensing the serious turn of conversation, moved closer to the adults. "Are you leaving, Pa Matthews?" Edward knelt to the boy's level. "Not right away, Tommy, but yes, eventually. Your ma and I have an opportunity in California. Can I go too?" Thomas asked innocently. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, her eyes filling with tears. "We love you so much, but your place is here with your father, with your real pa." Thomas looked between the Matthews and Mason, his young face troubled. "But I love all of you." Mason gathered his son into his arms. "And we all love you, Thomas. That won't change no matter where any of us live. The Matthews will always be your family, as will I." Sarah, watching this exchange, felt her heart swell with admiration for these people who put the boys' needs above their own emotions. In a harsh land where survival often demanded selfishness, such selflessness was remarkable. Later, after Thomas had been tucked into bed and the Matthews had returned to their home, Sarah helped Mason clear away the remains of their feast. "They're good people," Mason said quietly, gazing out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "Better than most." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "They love Thomas enough to let him go." Mason turned to her, his expression troubled. "Am I doing right by him, taking him from the only stable home he's known?" "You're his father," Sarah said gently, "and Thomas adores you. The Matthews have given you both an incredible gift, the chance to be a family again." Mason nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You've been a good friend through all this, Sarah, to me and to Thomas." "It's been my pleasure," she replied honestly. "Watching you two find each other, build a relationship, it's been beautiful." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Mason stepped closer, his hand rising to touch her cheek. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said quietly. "After Elizabeth, I thought that part of me was dead." Sarah's heart quickened. "And now I find myself looking forward, not back, hoping for things I'd given up on." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question as much as an answer. When they parted, Sarah's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright in the firelight. "I should go," she whispered. "It's late." Mason nodded but made no move to release her. Stay, he said simply. Not, I mean I have a spare room, the snow's getting worse. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. All right. For Thomas's sake, he'll want his teacher alive in the morning. Mason smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. For Thomas's sake, he agreed, though they both knew it was more than that. The winter months passed in a rhythm of work and family. Thomas transitioned gradually to living with Mason full-time, still spending occasional nights with the Matthews as they prepared for their move to California. The boy flourished under this arrangement, secure in the knowledge that he was deeply loved by all the adults in his life. Sarah became a frequent visitor to Mason's cabin, initially to help with Thomas's education, but increasingly because of the deepening bond between her and Mason. Their relationship grew slowly, both conscious of Thomas's needs and the small town's watchful eyes. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal. The Matthews made final preparations for their journey west, a bittersweet time for all involved. Thomas, though sad to see them go, had accepted the change with the resilience of childhood, especially as Mason and Sarah took care to maintain his sense of security. The day of the Matthews' departure dawned clear and mild. The entire town gathered to see them off, their wagon loaded with possessions and provisions for the long journey to California. Thomas clung to Margaret Matthews, his face buried in her skirts. "I'll miss you, Ma," he whispered. "Oh, my sweet boy," she replied, kneeling to embrace him properly. "We'll write you letters, and your pa will bring you to visit someday." Edward Matthews shook Mason's hand firmly. "Take care of our boy," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "With my life," Mason promised, "and thank you for everything you've done." The farewells were tearful but not bitter. Everyone understood that this arrangement, unconventional as it was, served Thomas's best interests. The Matthews would always be part of his life, just from a greater distance. As the wagon pulled away, Thomas stood between Mason and Sarah, each holding one of his hands. The boy waved until the Matthews wagon disappeared from sight, then looked up at his father. "Are we really going to visit them someday?" he asked. "I promise," Mason assured him, squeezing his son's hand. "Family is family, no matter how far apart." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "And Miss Collins?" "Is she family too?" Mason and Sarah exchanged a glance over the boy's head. "What do you think?" Mason asked carefully. Thomas considered this seriously. "I think she should be. She makes you smile, Pa, like in the stories you tell about my real ma." Sarah's cheeks colored, but she didn't look away from Mason's intense gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility, a future neither had dared imagine until now. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Mason and Sarah sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "He's a perceptive boy," Sarah observed, breaking the comfortable silence. Mason nodded. "Gets that from his mother." "Elizabeth could always see right through me too." "Does that bother you, that he noticed? Whatever this is between us," Mason turned to her, his expression earnest. "No, Thomas deserves honesty and happiness." "And you," Sarah asked softly, "what do you deserve?" Mason's hand found hers in the gathering darkness. "More than I ever thought I'd have again. A son, a home." He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "Maybe a future with someone who understands what family really means." Sarah's heart quickened. "Is that what you want?" "It is," Mason confirmed. "If you're willing." Their second kiss was different from the first, more certain, filled with promise rather than question. When they parted, Sarah rested her forehead against his. "Thomas needs stability," she murmured. "We should take this slowly." Mason nodded, though his arms remained around her. "Agreed, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable, Sarah Collins. I'm not a man who takes matters of the heart lightly." "Nor am I," she assured him, "but Thomas comes first for both of us." "Always," Mason agreed. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and color. Thomas thrived under the combined care of his father and Sarah, who continued teaching at the school but spent most evenings at the Ford cabin. The three of them formed a natural unit, their days filled with work and learning, their evenings with stories and laughter. Word came from California that the Matthews had arrived safely and were establishing themselves in their new home. Thomas dictated long letters in response, detailing his adventures with his father and Miss Collins, who comes for supper almost every night now. In July, Mason took Thomas on his first proper camping trip, just the two of them. They rode into the foothills, where Mason taught his son to fish in mountain streams, to identify animal tracks, to navigate by the stars. At night, beside their small campfire, Thomas asked about his mother. "Was she pretty, Pa?" Mason smiled at the memory. "The prettiest woman I'd ever seen. Hair black as midnight, eyes like yours, smart as a whip too, could read and write better than most men. Did she love me?" Thomas asked, his voice small. Mason pulled his son close. "More than anything in this world, Thomas, she died to save you. Hid you from the raiders, gave you my hat as proof. She knew I'd come looking." "I wish I remembered her," Thomas said wistfully. "She's part of you," Mason assured him, "in your smile, in your cleverness, in the way you stand up for what's right, just like she always did." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance. "Pa," Thomas said finally, "I think Ma would like Miss Collins." Mason looked at his son with surprise. "Do you now? Why's that?" "Because Miss Collins makes you happy," Thomas said simply, "and Ma would want you to be happy. That's what Ma Matthews always said about people who go to heaven. They want us to be happy." Mason swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're a wise boy, Thomas Ford. Does that mean you're going to marry Miss Collins?" Thomas asked, his expression hopeful. Mason chuckled despite himself. "Well now, that's getting ahead of things a bit, but would you like it if I did someday?" Thomas nodded eagerly. "Then she'd be my Ma, and I'd have a Pa and a Ma again, like other kids." "You already have a Ma," Mason reminded him gently. "She's watching over you from heaven. And the Matthews love you too, even from California." "I know," Thomas assured him, "but it would be nice to have a Ma here too, someone who could bake cookies and read stories and kiss me goodnight." Mason ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "We'll see, son, these things take time." When they returned to Copper Creek, Mason found himself viewing his relationship with Sarah through new eyes. What had begun as friendship, then cautiously evolved into courtship, now seemed to be pointing toward a more permanent arrangement, one that Thomas clearly approved of. The opportunity to speak with Sarah alone came a few days later, when Thomas was invited to a birthday celebration for one of his school friends. "He seems happier than ever," Sarah observed as they watched Thomas run off with the other children. "More settled." "The camping trip was good for us," Mason agreed. "We talked a lot about Elizabeth, about the Matthews." He paused, gathering his courage. "About you?" Sarah turned to him, her expression curious. "Oh, what about me?" "Thomas thinks I should marry you," Mason said directly, watching her face carefully. "He says you make me happy and that his mother would approve of that." Sarah's cheeks colored, but she held his gaze. "And what do you think, Mason Ford?" "I think my son is the wisest person I know," he replied, taking her hand. "I think that finding you here in this place after everything, it feels like more than chance." "Are you proposing?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Mason nodded. "Inelegantly, perhaps. But sincerely, I love you, Sarah Collins, and if you'll have me have us, Thomas and me, I would be honored to call you my wife." Sarah's free hand rose to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. "I love you both," she said simply. "Yes." Their engagement was announced the following Sunday after church services. The townsfolk of Copper Creek, who had witnessed the remarkable story of Mason and Thomas unfold over the past year, offered heartfelt congratulations. Even the most traditional among them had come to respect Mason's devotion to his son and his honorable intentions toward Sarah. Letters were dispatched to California, where the Matthews responded with enthusiastic approval and promises to attend the wedding if possible. Thomas, for his part, was ecstatic, proudly telling anyone who would listen that Miss Collins was going to be his new mother, but not replacing my real Ma, who's in heaven, or Ma Matthews, who's in California. The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season. It was a simple ceremony in Copper Creek's small church, attended by the entire town. Thomas stood proudly at his father's side, the old cowboy hat now a symbol of their extraordinary journey held carefully in his small hands. As Sarah walked down the aisle, radiant in a new blue dress, Mason felt a sense of completion he had never expected to find again. When they spoke their vows, Thomas stepped forward at the appointed moment, offering the hat to Sarah. "This was my real ma's for keeping," he explained seriously. "And then it was mine. Now it's for you two to show you're really family." Sarah knelt, accepting the hat with appropriate solemnity. "I'll keep it safe," she promised, "for all of us." The gesture, unplanned but perfect, brought tears to many eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Mason's kiss to his bride was accompanied by the cheers of the assembled townsfolk and the beaming smile of his son. The Matthews were unable to make the long journey from California for the ceremony, but they sent a beautiful quilt as a wedding gift, along with a letter expressing their joy that Thomas had found such a complete family circle. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing in the town square. As the night grew late, Mason and Sarah slipped away to their cabin, where Thomas had already been tucked into bed by a neighbor. "Are you happy?" Mason asked as they stood on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Sarah leaned into his embrace. "Completely, are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "When I lost Elizabeth when I was searching for Thomas, I never imagined finding this kind of happiness again." "Elizabeth would be proud," Sarah said softly, "of you, of Thomas, of the life you've built from such tragedy." Mason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She always said everything happens for a reason, even the terrible things. I couldn't see it then, but now I think maybe she was right. Not that losing her could ever make sense, but that even in the darkest times, there's a path forward if you're brave enough to keep walking it." Sarah turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "I'm honored to walk it with you, Mason Ford. You and Thomas both." Their life together settled into a rhythm as natural as the changing seasons. Sarah continued teaching, though now as Mrs. Ford rather than Miss Collins. Mason's reputation as a horseman grew, bringing steady work and respect. Thomas thrived in school and at home, secure in the love of his expanded family. Letters arrived regularly from California, where the Matthews were prospering in their new life. They sent photographs, gifts for Thomas's birthday, and constant assurances of their continued love for the boy they had raised for 5 years. When spring arrived again, Sarah shared news of her own. She was expecting a child. Thomas's excitement at the prospect of a sibling matched his father's quiet joy. The boy immediately appointed himself protector of Sarah, insisting on carrying anything heavier than a book and watching her with anxious attention that made both adults hide their smiles. "Will the baby know about my real ma?" Thomas asked one evening as Mason tucked him into bed. "Of course," Mason assured him. "We'll tell him or her all about Elizabeth, and about the Matthews, and about how brave you were, keeping my old hat safe all those years." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "And will you love the baby as much as you love me?" Mason sat on the edge of the bed, his hand gentle on his son's shoulder. "Thomas, love doesn't divide when you share it, it multiplies. When you came back into my life, my heart grew bigger. When Sarah joined our family, it grew again. The same will happen with the baby." "Promise?" Thomas asked sleepily. "I promise," Mason said, kissing his son's forehead. "Nothing in this world could ever make me love you less." The baby, a girl they named Elizabeth Margaret Ford, arrived in late autumn, with Thomas standing guard outside the bedroom door while Sarah labored within. When Mason finally emerged, his face weary but radiant, Thomas looked up with anxious eyes. "You have a sister," Mason told him, kneeling to his level, "and she's perfect." Thomas's first meeting with his sister was solemn and tender. He approached the bed where Sarah lay cradling the infant, his steps careful, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. "She's so small," he whispered. "You were this small once," Sarah told him with a tired smile. "Would you like to hold her?" With Mason's help, Thomas cradled his sister in his arms, his face transforming with wonder as tiny fingers wrapped around his own. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said softly. "I'm your big brother, Thomas. I'm going to teach you everything." As Mason watched his son with his daughter, his heart so full it seemed impossible to contain, he thought of that day more than a year ago, when he had stood in the doorway of Copper Creek schoolhouse, hoping against hope that the rumors were true. He remembered the moment Thomas had held out the old hat, his hat, the one Elizabeth had pressed into their son's hands as she hid him from danger. He remembered falling to his knees, weeping openly as the truth washed over him. He remembered claiming his son in front of the entire town, uncaring of who witnessed his tears. That moment had been an ending and a beginning, the end of his solitary search, the beginning of a new life he could never have imagined. Now, as he joined his family on the bed, one arm around Sarah, the other supporting Thomas as he held the baby, Mason felt the circle complete. "Look at what you started," he whispered, his words meant for Elizabeth, his first wife, the woman who had loved their son enough to save him, to send him forward with proof of his heritage. Sarah, understanding without being told, reached for his hand. "She knows," she said softly. "Wherever she is, she knows." Thomas looked up from his sister's face. "Pa, can I show Elizabeth the hat someday when she's bigger?" "Of course," Mason assured him, his voice thick with emotion. "It's part of her story too, part of all of us." That night, after both children were asleep, Thomas in his room, baby Elizabeth in the cradle Mason had crafted by hand, husband and wife stood on their porch, gazing up at the star-filled New Mexico sky. "Thank you," Mason said simply, his arm around Sarah's waist. "For what?" she asked, leaning into his warmth. "For loving us, for completing this family, for understanding where we've been and helping us see where we're going." Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "You did the hard part, Mason. You never gave up." "On Thomas, on finding happiness again. That's the miracle here." Mason shook his head. "The miracle is that boy sleeping inside, the one who kept my old hat as proof, who believed his father would come for him someday. The one who opened his heart to you, to the Matthews, to his sister. Thomas is the bravest of us all." As if summoned by their words, the cabin door creaked open and Thomas appeared, tousled with sleep but determined. "I heard the baby crying," he explained. Though Elizabeth was still sleeping peacefully, Mason smiled knowingly. "Did you now? Well, since you're up, come join us for a moment." Thomas padded out onto the porch and Mason lifted him into his arms, though the boy was getting almost too big for such treatment. Together, the three of them gazed up at the stars, a family forged through loss and perseverance, through a father's unrelenting search and a child's unwavering faith. "Look there," Mason said, pointing to a particularly bright star. "That's your mother's star, Elizabeth's. She's watching over all of us." Thomas followed his father's gaze upward. "All of us, even baby Elizabeth, especially baby Elizabeth," Sarah assured him, "and the Matthews in California and everyone who loves you." Thomas considered this, his small face solemn in the starlight. "And she's watching over you too, Pa, because you found me, just like she knew you would." Mason pressed a kiss to his son's head, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. In that moment, under the vast New Mexico sky, he felt the presence of everyone who had brought them to this point. Elizabeth, who had saved their son at the cost of her own life. The Matthews, who had given Thomas a home when he had none. Sarah, who had helped heal their broken family. And most of all, he felt the weight of his son in his arms, the boy who had kept faith, who had carried an old cowboy hat as proof of his heritage, who had recognized his father even after years apart. "Time for bed, young man," Sarah said gently, noting Thomas's drooping eyelids. "Can I check on Elizabeth first?" Thomas asked, ever the protective brother. "Of course," Mason agreed, setting him down. "Quietly, though, let her sleep." As Thomas tiptoed back inside, Mason and Sarah remained on the porch a moment longer, their hands intertwined. "I never expected this," Mason admitted, "any of it. The best things in life are rarely what we expect," Sarah replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "They're better." Inside the cabin, Thomas stood beside his sister's cradle, watching her sleep. The old cowboy had his father's hat, his heritage, his proof rested on a shelf nearby, a testament to the journey that had brought them all together. From the first day he could remember, Thomas had been told to keep the hat safe, that someday his father would come for him. He hadn't understood then what it meant, this strange inheritance. Now, as he looked between the sleeping baby and the weathered hat, he began to grasp the true value of what he had carried all those years. Not just leather and sweat and memories, but hope. Proof that love could survive anything, even death, even years of separation, even the vast distances of the frontier. Proof that family was something you carried with you always, something no raid or tragedy could take away. Thomas touched his sister's tiny hand gently, then whispered, "I'll keep you safe too, just like the hat, that's what family does." And outside, under the endless stars, Mason and Sarah Ford held each other close, guardians of this precious, improbable family, this second chance none of them had dared to dream possible. In the years that followed, the Ford family thrived in Copper Creek. Mason's reputation as a horseman brought steady work and respect. Sarah continued teaching until their family grew further with the addition of another son, whom they named Edward, after Mr. Matthews. Thomas excelled in school and developed a natural talent with horses that made his father beam with pride. The old hat remained a treasured family artifact, displayed prominently in their home. When Thomas turned 16, Mason officially presented it to him in a small ceremony attended by their closest friends. By then, the hat had become something of a local legend, the tangible symbol of a father's devotion and a child's faith. The Matthews visited from California when they could, always welcomed as family. Thomas maintained a regular correspondence with them, his letters evolving from childish scrawls to thoughtful reflections as he matured into a young man. Baby Elizabeth grew into a spirited girl with her mother's intelligence and her namesake's determination. And on clear nights, the family would often gather on their porch, gazing up at the stars that had guided Mason on his long journey home. Sometimes Thomas would bring out the old hat, turning it in his hands as he told his siblings the story of how their father had searched half the territory to find him, how he had wept and claimed him in front of the entire town, how a simple cowboy hat had been the proof that bound their family across time and tragedy. It was, Mason would reflect in quiet moments, more happiness than any man had a right to expect in one lifetime. But as Sarah often reminded him with her practical wisdom, some men search their whole lives and never find what matters. You knew what mattered, Mason Ford. You knew, and you never stopped looking. And that, perhaps, was the truest legacy of the old hat, not just that it had served as proof of Thomas's heritage, but that it had been a beacon of hope when hope seemed foolish, a reason to continue when continuing seemed impossible. Like the stars Elizabeth had loved, it had guided Mason home not to a place, but to the people who made a place worth calling home. In the end, that was the story Thomas would tell his own children years later as they gathered around the old hat, now carefully preserved in a glass case. The story of a father's love, a mother's sacrifice, and a child's unwavering faith. The story of a family torn apart and miraculously reunited. The story of how an old cowboy hat had carried the proof of who they were and who they were meant to be. And in that story, as in all the best stories, love had proven stronger than distance, than time, than even death itself. In that story, as Mason Ford had discovered on that fateful day in Copper Creek schoolhouse, tears were not a sign of weakness but of courage, the courage to claim what was precious, to acknowledge what was lost, and to embrace what was found. In that story, a cowboy wept and claimed his son in front of all, and in doing so, reclaimed his own heart.